Hi friends, welcome to Queer Kid Stuff. I'm Linz, and this is Teddy's Book Club. Now, normally on Teddy's Book Club, my best friend Teddy and I read picture books by LGBTQ+ authors, but today is a very special Teddy's Book Club because I'm just talking to the grown-ups today, and I want to talk to you about my brand new book that's coming out May 30th. This is my first book. It's called Rainbow Parenting, Your Guide to Raising Queer Kids and Their Allies. And I am so excited for you all to read this book. And I thought I could maybe give you a little bit of a sneak peek and tell you what it's all about. All right, so I thought we could go over the table of contents because I love knowing what's going to be in my books before I buy them and before I read them. So before we get to that, I want to show you the dedication. I dedicated this book to every queer and trans kid because I hope it helps. And I really do hope that this book helps. I hope that this book can be a tool and a guide for grown-ups who have kids in their lives and want to raise them in a queer and gender affirming way, but maybe don't know how. So let's get to the table of contents. So the way that this book is structured is we have this big introductory section. The introduction, which has a little bit of my story, a little bit of the background on Queer Kid Stuff and how we made that happen, and just a little bit of a welcome to the book, here's how we can use it, and about staying vulnerable and it being okay to make mistakes. So this really gentle, welcoming introductory section. And then we get into the first part, which I call part 1, the stakes. And this, I'm not gonna sugarcoat it for you. This part of the book is kind of the toughest section, but it's worth it, I promise. It is worth it to get through this section because it's gonna make everything else in the book so much easier to get through and to implement in your day-to-day lives. So, part of this section, the stakes, we talk about the state of LGBTQ+ youth. And that's really important because so much is going on right now. And we're seeing anti-trans legislation that's targeting young queer and trans people, and just so many different things that are making it really difficult to be a young person and also a queer and trans person, especially in the United States right now and all over the world, right? So we're going to talk about what's at stake here. We're going to talk about why this book and this work of rainbow parenting is important in the first place. And, you know, all of you here at Queer Kid Stuff, I'm sure have an idea of that, but this section really gets into it. So we talk through kind of the obstacles that happen, especially when we're talking about queer and trans related topics and when it comes to kids and queer and gender related ideas. Then I talk about an formative experience in my career when a play that I directed when I was in undergrad was canceled. And we've seen those themes throughout all of my work, Queer Kid Stuff especially. I talk about something called childism. That is the discrimination against children for being children. And then we work through our biases and our internal stigmas around queerness and transness in kids. And that is really like the heart of this, the stakes section. That's really important, but also might be a little bit tough to get through. But I think it's important to stick it out, and that way we can start getting into the kind of meat and potatoes of the book. The way that it's structured is that we go through childhood, essentially, from infancy in this first section up here. Then we go through toddlerhood, that's ages 1 to 2. We go through pre-K and elementary schoolers, and then we get to the conclusion of the book. So we're kind of talking about how we can approach these topics around queerness and sexuality and gender and transness and non-binariness and some sex ed topics throughout all of these age groups. So with infancy, we'll start at the very beginning. We'll talk about gender reveal parties. We'll talk about something I'm calling gender conscious parenting. We're talking about how infancy is sort of practice time. making and nurturing a queer and gender affirming environment for your kid. We're going to talk about babies and consent and how you can start folding consent practices in even when they're infants. And then we're going to talk about lots and lots of books, which are super important, especially when you're talking about babies and you can start building that wonderful picture book collection. All right, then we get into toddlers. Toddlers are these tiny human sponges. They absorb everything. So we'll talk about that. We'll get into a little bit of queer theory for kids. How can we explain queerness and difference? Because queer means different. And if you heard the Unicorn song, you'll already know that. Talk about how being different is awesome. Then we get into a couple of age-relevant sex ed topics, talking about how age-relevant sex ed is abuse prevention, talking about body kindness, body ownership and consent, a very important thing, body language and using correct anatomical language with your child, and then the dreaded question, where do babies come from? We'll address that, and also how to talk about that in a queer and gender conscious way, making sure we're using vocabulary that's inclusive of everyone. All right, now we're getting to pre-K section. This is kind of like the big section. This is like the heart of all of this work, right? So these are the crucial years. We'll talk about why these years, this pre-K year is so important for this work. We'll get into the nitty-gritty already about gender identity, expression, and gender euphoria, 3 very important foundational concepts when we're talking about gender. We'll introduce pronouns, we'll talk about dress up and drag, clothing stores, toy stores, talking about boys who wear dresses and addressing toxic masculinity. We'll get into gender assignment and dolls as well, and how you can use dolls to talk about gender assignment with kids. We'll talk about pivoting awkward questions. I think that's something that can be a real obstacle for people. So I'll kind of talk you through how you can work through those maybe sticky moments. We'll tackle some sexuality topics. We'll go back to, the first episode of Queer Kid Stuff. What does gay mean? We'll talk about this little equation that I like to use that's gender plus love equals sexuality. We'll go over different kinds of families, and we'll even get into an introduction to activism and social justice, dip into what is intersectionality, talk about privilege and fairness, and use vocabulary that kids understand and can grasp to talk about those things. And we'll talk about what is social justice exactly. All right, and that's our pre-K section, and then this last section is for elementary school and really beyond, ages 4 and beyond. So this is the first day of kindergarten. We're going off to elementary school. We'll revisit our ideas around gender and our foundational understanding of what we've talked about already. We'll go over non-binary gender and the gender spectrum. These are all ideas that I've talked about in Queer Kid Stuff, but this is a guide for parents and caregivers and educators for how you can take, what I've already talked about in Queer Kid Stuff and really implement it in your day-to-day lives. We'll talk about the differences between being cisgender and transgender, and then we'll go into our LGBTs. If you've already watched those videos, you'll know that. We'll decode the acronym, and we'll get into kind of a little bit of the different vocabulary that might come up when you're discussing sexuality. Then we'll get a little bit deeper into intersectionality. This is kind of a big section about identity and how queerness is really isn't confined to any one identity, any one race or class or ability or religion. We'll get into all of that stuff. We'll talk about equality and equity and justice and the differences between those 3 things. We'll talk about class and capitalism, disability and neurodiversity, mental health, religion, climate change even, and native justice. And we'll talk about broadly within activism. We'll get into how we can focus our passions and our want for change and how we can start doing that for ourselves, but also for our families and within our families, and instilling those values right with young people. Talking about how there's no one way to be an activist. We'll talk about the differences between allyship and camaraderie. That's a really important word that I talk about a lot in the book. We'll work on getting comfortable with our own discomfort. We'll talk about upstanders versus bystanders, and then we'll start getting into a little bit of LGBTQ plus history for kids. We'll talk about queer people throughout history, how to talk to kids about Stonewall, Pride Kids and Kink discourse. This is a very important thing that, especially as we're going into Pride Month, I think this is a really important little section here. And then we'll talk about the HIV/AIDS crisis and how we can talk to young kids about that as well in a age-relevant way. And then we'll talk about LGBTQ plus history and progress, and then that's our conclusion. We also have a pretty robust section of additional resources and book recommendations that I put together for you all at the end of this, so I wouldn't skip that for sure, making sure that that is a reference for you all to go back to help build up your bookshelves and support other wonderful queer and trans-owned small businesses and creatives. All right, and then I thought I would give you a little sneak peek and do a reading of this first little introductory section. It's called Spread Queer Joy, a Mission Statement. You know that saying, if you give a person a fish, you feed them for a day. If you teach a person to fish, you feed them for a lifetime. The gender binary of the original proverb aside, in this book, we're going to learn how to fish together. No matter whether you're a parent, an educator, a librarian, a creator, or someone who picked this book off the shelf and flipped to the first page because the title sounded cool. Maybe you're queer or trans or non-binary, but you were raised in the same cis heteronormative hellscape as the rest of us and don't know how to go about queer and gender-affirming parenting. Maybe your favorite cousin is non-binary and you want your kids to understand their identity but don't know how to start the conversation. Or maybe you're an educator who wants support in bringing queer and gender-affirming lessons into your classroom. Regardless of your individual context for coming to this book, you are here because you care about the littlest folks among us and are interested in creating a queer and gender-affirming environment around them where they can thrive. I call that spreading queer joy. But what does that mean exactly? Do you have to run around in a unicorn onesie singing about pride and rainbows? I mean, that's what I do every Wednesday afternoon, but it's definitely not a requirement. Spreading queer joy for me is a mission, a philosophy, a methodology, a pedagogy, a mode of being, a North Star, a thesis statement, a mantra. To spread is to act. It is something that can be done. It is active and motivated and driven and progressing forward with relentless momentum and exponential in its expansion. It is queer, different, unique, other, divergent, diverse, and stunningly beautiful. This queerness is intersectional. It is ubiquitous, and by that I mean that queerness is everywhere. It knows no bounds. Queerness exists across race, ethnicity, culture, geography, even species. Queer for me in my life has been the center, the rule, not the exception. And joy is unbridled happiness, kindness, rainbows, unicorns, glitter, and the best of our collective wildest imaginations. So much is held in these three words: spread, queer, joy. They are the blanket that comforts, the shield that protects, the glitter that glimmers, and the balm that heals. I will guide you, yes, you, dear reader, in spreading queer joy to everyone from your newborn to your great-great-grandparents. This work is familial and ancestral. It is the work that will bring about the world that ought to be. Spreading queer joy is the work of utopia building. And to succeed, we must all be builders. Or, to continue the metaphor, fisher folk. If you teach someone to spread queer joy, they'll keep spreading it farther. That's just a little snippet of what's to come when you get Rainbow Parenting, your guide to raising queer kids and their allies. It is out May 30th, wherever books are sold. Right now, you can pre-order it through the links in the description below. I'm doing a ton of events that are celebrating the launch of Rainbow Parenting, so head over to my Instagram or the Queer Kid Stuff Instagram and you can find information about those. I'm doing author Q&As in 7 cities across the country during Pride Month. I'm also doing a bunch of family performances with me and Teddy, so you can check those out again on the Queer Kid Stuff website or Instagram, or join our newsletter, any one of those places. You'll be able to find information about all of those events. So please pre-order, and while you're waiting for your book to come, you can catch up on our first 2 seasons of the Rainbow Parenting podcast, and we have a 3rd season that's coming out very soon, and I'm really excited for you to listen to some of those guests. And yeah, that's all for now. Pre-order Rainbow Parenting. Thanks so much, everyone. Bye. See you next time.